Reading the Times for Wednesday, March 4th, 2020. Biden revives campaign winning 9 states, but Sanders takes California. The Democratic presidential race emerged from Super Tuesday with 2 clear front-runners as Joseph R. Biden Jr. won Texas, Virginia, North Carolina, and at least 6 other states, largely through the support from African Americans and moderates, while Senator Bernie Sanders harnessed the backing of liberals and young voters to claim the biggest prize of the campaign, California, and several other primaries. In a surprising upset, Mr. Biden even captured Mr. Warren's home state of Massachusetts, where he did not appear in person, and where Mr. Sanders had campaigned aggressively in recent days. Mr. Biden's sweep of states across the South and Midwest showed he has the makings of a formidable coalition that could propel him through the primaries. Democrats decide that Joe Biden, as risky as he ever was, is the safest bet. For all of Mr. Biden's stumbles in Iowa and New Hampshire, at debates, at his own events, perhaps all voters needed was to hear him give a victory speech. Voters wary of Mr. Sanders are probably right that supporting Mr. Biden is the tidiest way to keep the Democratic Socialist from the top of the ticket. Mr. Sanders has said he regrets his voting history on some gun legislation. Mr. Biden has faced consistent criticism, including from Mr. Sanders, for his vote authorizing the use of military force in Iraq, among other decisions. Fed makes emergency rate cut, but markets continue tumbling. The Federal Reserve slashed interest rates on Tuesday in an extraordinary attempt to contain economic fallout from the coronavirus, with policymakers voting unanimously for their biggest single cut and first emergency rate move since the depths of the 2008 financial crisis. Stocks in the United States spiked only temporarily after the rate cut, as worries about the Fed's impotence in the face of coronavirus economic risk fueled a market sell-off. After the cut was announced, Mr. Trump told reporters that the rate is too high. It should be eased down so we're competitive, adding we should have the low rate, but we have a Fed that doesn't agree with that. I disagree with them. Iran's coronavirus response: pride, paranoia, secrecy, chaos. In the northern Iran's Golestan province, where Iran has acknowledged about 24 infections, the top health official railed at news conference on Sunday about his frustration with Tehran's refusal to acknowledge the extent of the epidemic. On Monday, Iranian state media reported that at least one official had even died from the virus. Mohammad Mirmahomadi, 71, a member of the Expediency Council, which advises Iran's supreme leader. Iran has prided itself for decades on the strength of the public health system, said Dr. Afkhami, the author of a book about Iran's past response to epidemics. Tornadoes kill 25 in Tennessee, shredding buildings in Nashville area. At least 14 fatalities were reported in Putnam County, roughly 80 miles east of Nashville, and deaths were also reported in Davidson, Benton, and Wilson counties. In Nashville, the police said a man and a woman had died after being struck by debris in East Nashville, an area of the city that had been among the hardest hit. In Benton County, about 100 miles west of Nashville, at least 3 fatalities had been reported, and officials were out assessing the toll. The wall some Texans want to build against abortion. The new local actions on abortion are playing out as the U.S. Supreme Court is set to hear oral arguments Wednesday on a case that thrust abortion, one of America's most divisive issues, into the middle of the presidential campaign. The case, a challenge to a Louisiana law that opponents say would leave the state with just one doctor in a single clinic authorized to provide abortions, could limit the scope of the constitutional right to abortion established in a 1973 Roe v. Wade. Hope Medical Group for Women, the clinic at the heart of the case, sparked the Texas movement to create sanctuary cities for the unborn. Abortion politics always reflect and transform broader American politics, said Mary Ziegler, law professor at Florida State University and author of Abortion and the Law in America. We're more polarized on a lot of issues. We're not in seeking compromise kind of mood. Ace of Base, why Netanyahu seems unsinkable. In cities in central Israel like Rishon, LeZion, blue-collar and middle-class police officers, contractors, and government workers who have dallied with other parties over pocketbook issues came home to Likud in Mr. Netanyahu's hour of need. The party pushed to expand settlements in occupied territory has improved the lives of many working-class Mizrahim who moved to subsidized homes in the West Bank. Mr. Netanyahu has made himself one with the Mizrahim, championing their causes and nursing their grievances. For many younger Mizrahim, Mr. Netanyahu, who has been prime minister for a decade, most of their adult lives, is not only Likud, he's a towering figure in a great Jewish narrative, a latter-day king of Israel. Putin proposes constitutional ban on gay marriage. President Vladimir V. Putin has proposed a constitutional amendment banning gay marriage in what political analysts suggest is an effort to raise turnout for a constitutional referendum that could keep him in power, but so far stirred little enthusiasm among Russians. Another amendment notes that Russia is the language of the state-forming nationality, phrasing seeming intended to appeal to Russian nationalists, though the article clarifies that all ethnic groups, of which Russians has a wide variety, are equal. Mr. Putin has not made public the proposed new amendments, but members of parliament revealed them to the Russian news media on Monday, and the newspaper Vedomosti published a list. No way out in China. Coronavirus takes toll on other patients. In Wuhan, many hospitals have been converted into facilities for treating only patients with the coronavirus. Last month, the Wuhan Health Commission said it would open 6 hospitals specifically for treating patients with illnesses other than the coronavirus. The National Health Commission has also ordered hospitals to begin normalizing operations, and some hospitals in Shanghai and Guangzhou announced that they were reopening their outpatient clinics this week. As coronavirus hits UK, health workers fear getting sick and growing broke. Officials have said little about the risk posed to low-paid workers, contract workers like Al-Hakim, who constitute a growing number of the health service workforce. On Monday, one of the Britain's biggest unions, GMB, called on hospitals to ensure that all outsourced workers suspected of having the coronavirus are given sick day. Danny Mortimer, the chief executive of NHS Employers, a group that represents workforce leaders in the health service, acknowledged that contract workers face a dilemma because they're reduced sick pay. Iran crosses a key threshold. It again has sufficient fuel for a bomb. Iran's growing stockpile of nuclear fuel recently crossed a critical threshold, according to a report issued Tuesday by international inspectors. For the first time since President Trump abandoned the 2015 nuclear deal, Tehran appears to have enough enriched uranium to produce a single nuclear warhead, though it would take months or years to manufacture a warhead and deliver it over long distances. The International Atomic Energy Agency, which monitors nuclear capabilities and reports to the United Nations, also documented for the first time how Iran's leadership blocked its inspectors from visiting 3 critical sites where there was evidence of past nuclear activity. Israel has doled out some of the findings to reporters, experts, and the IAEA. David Albright, the president of the International Institute for Science and International Security, a nonprofit in Washington that tracks nuclear proliferation, said in an interview that if Iran did race for a bomb, it might need another 3 to 4 months to turn the newly revealed amount of uranium into a highly enriched material at the heart of a nuclear warhead. It's worrisome, he said. Trump speaks with a Taliban leader. President Trump spoke on Tuesday with the deputy leader of the Taliban, Mullah Abdul Ghani Baradar, in the latest sign of his determination to seek a peace deal, signed Saturday, what the Afghan insurgent group holds, allowing him to withdraw thousands of American troops from Afghanistan in an election year. The statement said Mr. Trump told the Taliban leader that the Afghan people were strong, that Afghanistan was a nice country, and that American withdrawal would be good for everyone involved. In the statement on Tuesday, the Taliban also said Mr. Trump assured Mr. Baradar that the Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, would speak to Mr. Ghani to remove hurdles to the so-called intra-Afghan talks. An abortion clinic's fate before a transformed Supreme Court. 2 justices appointed by President Trump have joined the court since the last time it heard a major abortion case. And the arguments on Wednesday will illuminate the impact of that rightward shift. Abortion is a safe procedure, she said, and hospitalizations after abortions are rare. Abortion regulations do not impose a substantial obstacle unless they make abortions nearly impossible to obtain, the brief said. Supreme Court divided on Trump's power to fire head of Consumer Bureau. In the case before the justices, a challenge to the constitutionality of the Consumer Bureau's leadership structure, the court's conservative majority generally seemed open to settling limits on agencies' independence. Businesses have repeatedly challenged the limits on the president's power to remove the Consumer Bureau director, saying that they violated the separation of powers. The firm lost in the United States Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit in San Francisco, which concluded that Supreme Court precedents upholding limits on presidential power to remove officials on multi-member commissions and independence councils allowed the Bureau's structure. How the Democratic candidates would tackle the housing crisis. Ms. Warren would provide $25 billion for the Capital Magnet Fund, which builds homes for low and middle income households, and $4 billion for Middle-Class Housing Emergency Fund. Mr. Biden would create $100 billion affordable housing funds. $100 billion affordable housing fund. Ms. Warren's campaign said that she did not want a federal rent control law, but she strongly supports state and local rent control efforts, which she believes will be more effective at protecting renters from unacceptable rent increases while ensuring adequate affordable housing supply. Mr. Sanders' campaign said that while he supported a renter's tax credit, it must be paired with rent control to ensure that it's not a windfall for real estate investors. A landlord should not be allowed to raise rents at will and then have the federal government subsidize those rent increases, he said. Trump meets with key Republicans amid stalemate over surveillance laws. Several House Republicans pushed for a bill that would impose sharp new limits on national security wiretapping, and Mr. Trump appeared to be more sympathetic to the idea of a sweeping overhaul. 2. According to officials, Mr. Trump frequent complaints about surveillance whipped up new levels of support among some of his congressional allies for broad new restrictions on the FBI. The president has pointed to his wiretapping of his former campaign advisor, Carter Page, under the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, or FISA, as evidence of the Bureau abused its power in an effort to undermine it. While Mr. McConnell and many Republican senators want to largely leave the surveillance powers intact, deferring to Mr. Barr to make policy changes within the Justice Department to address concerns raised by Mr. Trump, some of the most vocal opponents come from within the Republican ranks. California has driest February on record. Here's how bad it was. February in California was so dry that it's raising concerns at the state, which, according to the National Drought Mitigation Center, only fully emerged from drought last March, may be headed for another one. The state had a very dry winter and a dry autumn, too. The United States Drought Monitor is also showing that much of Oregon, Washington State, and Nevada are also currently experiencing abnormally dry conditions. Oklahoma's college recruiter lined up high school students by skin color and hair type. A college recruiter from Oklahoma Christian University is no longer working for the school after he told a group of high school students to line up organized by their skin color and hair texture. Officials said on Tuesday. The president of the university, John DeSteguier, visited the school on Monday to apologize to students and staff members, the university said in an email on Tuesday. Harding Charter, one of the top public high schools in the state, has a diverse student body comprising equally of Hispanic, white, and African American students, Mr. Stefanik said. Chemical industry executive nominated to lead consumer watchdog agency. President Trump has tapped Nancy B. Beck, a former chemical industry executive, to lead the Consumer Product Safety Commission, an independent federal agency charged with protecting the public against dangers like toxic substances and products. Dr. Beck previously led the Environmental Protection Agency's Office of Chemical Safety, a position she came to after serving as a senior director of regulatory science policy at the American Chemistry Council, a lobbying group for the chemical industry. On Tuesday, the group's president, Ken Cook, called Dr. Beck's track record riddled with disregard for the risks that toxic chemicals pose to human health. Doubts linger as Democrats vote. I don't think we have a perfect candidate. Mr. Biden's commanding victory in South Carolina on Saturday and his endorsement by 3 former presidential candidates on Monday, an effort to bring moderates together and halt Mr. Sanders, swayed some voters at another voting site in Adams County, which is about 40% Hispanic. Jose and Mayela Garcia Alba pulled up in the rattling Bronx sedan to vote for Mr. Sanders. 4 years ago, Mrs. Clinton defeated Mr. Sanders in the state among not only white and black voters, but also Latinos. In Bernie Sanders' country, it's Super Tuesday and also Town Meeting Day. Town Meeting Day is traditionally held on the first Tuesday in March, though some towns have their meetings the evening before. In Jericho, a town of about 5,000 people 15 miles east of Burlington, while several hundred people participated in a meeting at one end of the school, a stream of voters came in to vote in local and primary elections at the other end. At least in town meeting, people seem relieved to not have to talk about national politics. The magic number on Super Tuesday. The delegates would be split proportionally among them, meaning Mr. Sanders would get at most 4 delegates out of the district. Now, with Mr. Buttigieg and Ms. Klobuchar out of the race, the question is whether their supporters might help put Mr. Biden, Ms. Warren, and Mr. Bloomberg over that 15% mark in enough states and districts to prevent Mr. Sanders from building an insurmountable lead. It's unclear whether the voters backing Mr. Buttigieg and Ms. Klobuchar would follow their lead and flip to Mr. Biden. Sydney Ember covering Bernie Sanders. By the time polls begin to close on Tuesday, Bernie Sanders will have been in 6 states, as he looks to amass an insurmountable delegate lead on Super Tuesday. Jeff Sessions forced into runoff in fight to reclaim Senate seat in Alabama. Jeff Sessions, a former attorney general who emerged from political exile and defied President Trump to run for the United States Senate in Alabama, suffered a setback on Tuesday in his fight to win back the seat he held for 20 years, falling well short of a majority and landing in a runoff election where he will compete with a Republican rival from a weakened position. A third Republican, Brady Byrne, a congressman from the Mobile area who tried to overcome his long association with the Republican Party establishment by also tethering himself to Mr. Trump, conceded defeat on Tuesday night. God sent us Donald Trump because God knew we were in trouble, he said, promising to go to Washington to help Trump build the border wall and drain the proverbial swamp. Sanders' campaign was caught off guard by quick massing of opposition. Even after Mr. Biden handily won in South Carolina on Saturday, beating Mr. Sanders by nearly 30 percentage points, aides had spent Sunday reluctant to declare the primary 2-person race between Mr. Sanders and Mr. Biden. Since Mr. Sanders got into the race a year ago, his top advisors have ached for a 2-party race with Mr. Biden, viewing the moderate former vice president as a perfect foil for Mr. Sanders' promise of a political revolution, a throwback Democrat who doubts his ability to work with Republicans and who has been criticized by rivals for telling donors that under a Biden administration, nothing would fundamentally change. Even before Mr. Reid's phone call, the Sanders campaign had been gearing up for a showdown with Mr. Biden. Ivanka Trump now acknowledges, "I'm a proud Trump Republican." Ahead of the New Hampshire primary in February, Ms. Trump traveled to Portsmouth to participate in a Cops for Trump event. Jared Kushner, Ms. Trump's husband and a free-floating senior advisor to Mr. Trump, has also recently been said publicly he had become a Republican. Ms. Trump declined to say which Democrat she would like to see face off against Mr. Trump in the general election. Any American can now be tested for the coronavirus, Pence says. The Trump administration sent mixed signals on Tuesday about how quickly testing for the coronavirus would ramp up, stressing that close to 1 million coronavirus tests should be available this week, but also that the number of tests being administered remained unknown. A spokesman for the Department of Health and Human Services on Monday said that the public health labs currently can test 15,000 people and could test up to 75,000 by the end of the week, numbers that fall well short of what Dr. Hahn suggested could result from private manufacturing. The Association of Public Health Laboratories, which represents state and local government laboratories across the country, said that its labs would be able to conduct about 10,000 tests a day when all of its 100 members can perform testing are running. Worship in the age of coronavirus. Prayer, elbow bumps, hand sanitizers. Church employees have placed hand sanitizer bottles in every pew at St. Michael's Episcopal Church in Brattleboro, Vermont. The Reverend Mary Lindquist made a point of telling worshipers on Sunday that she was sanitizing her hands before distributing communion. Over the weekend, the Reverend Matt Paul, pastor of First Presbyterian Church of Port Angels, Washington, incorporated the coronavirus into his sermon. The Fed has no tools for an outbreak. Here's why it acted anyway. The list of reasons that the Federal Reserve shouldn't have cut interest rates on Tuesday is long. Lower rates will do nothing to address the root cause of potential economic distress, namely supply disruptions and halted economic activity because of the novel coronavirus. There has been a recurring idea ever since the financial crisis that the central banks are the only game in town in economic policy, that they use the interest rate and quantitative easing policies to try to stabilize the economy because political authorities will not. Estimates fall short of FDA's pledge for 1 million coronavirus tests. The Association of Public Health Laboratories, which represents state and local government laboratories around the country, has said its labs will be able to conduct about 10,000 tests a day when all of its 100 members can perform testing are running. New York State's Public Health Lab, which was one of the first to receive emergency approval for its own test, set a goal of conducting 1,000 tests a day statewide, according to a statement by Governor Andrew M. Cuomo. The CDC began shipping test kits to labs around the country in early February, but a manufacturing problem led the agency to tell most states not to use the kits, severely limiting the country's testing capability for weeks. Coronavirus deaths tied to nursing center came earlier than anyone knew. One visitor to the center apparently traveled home to North Carolina before being tested positive for the virus, an outcome North Carolina officials announced on Tuesday. At Harborview Medical Center, where one person has died, officials were working to determine which staff members have been exposed to the virus. Officials in Washington state were rushing to take steps to contain the spread. Health officials were asking the state legislature for additional $100 million in funding to help respond to the virus. Trump makes room for experts, but still takes a lead role on coronavirus. At a campaign rally this week in North Carolina, President Trump reassured the crowd that he had jawboned the nation's pharmaceutical companies into quickly tackling the coronavirus. In confronting the first major health crisis of his presidency, Mr. Trump has made himself the primary source of information to the public with mixed results. At times, Mr. Trump has been corrected, gently but unmistakably, by the health experts standing next to him, the microphone. Second case of coronavirus in New York set off search for others exposed. Its two schools in New York City were closed as a precautionary measure, the SAR Academy and the SAR High School in Riverdale neighborhood of the Bronx, and Westchester Day School in Mamaroneck, New York, in New York City. The SAR school administrators sent an email to parents and faculty saying it was closing on Tuesday for precautionary measures. Mr. Cuomo said during a news conference on Tuesday that one of the Westchester patient children attended SAR. The school, which describes itself as a modern Orthodox Jewish day school, canceled classes because of a suspected case of coronavirus, according to the email, but urged parents and staff to remain calm and follow advised preventative measures. The Westchester Day School, a private Jewish day school, closed over an abundance of caution, said Rachel Goldman, the school's executive director. Worried about coronavirus on the subway? Here's what we know. As cases of coronavirus increased in the United States and public health officials urge healthy Americans to avoid contact with those who are sick, many people who live and work in New York wonder how they can do that given the heavy reliance on public transit. From Monday evening to midday Tuesday, transit workers disinfected nearly all of the system's 472 subway stations, over 1,900 subway cars, and nearly 2,000 buses, officials said. In Tehran, public health officials have said they are disinfecting buses at least 4 times a day and cleaning trains in the city's subway system at the beginning and the end of each line. Best treatment for the coronavirus? Paid sick leave. Roughly 1/4 of workers in the private sector, about 32 million people, are not entitled to any paid sick leave. Among the people least likely to have paid sick days and therefore most likely to work through illness are low-wage service workers like restaurant employees and home healthcare aides. Whatever the course of the coronavirus, mandatory sick leave for American workers would improve the lives of families and insulate the economy against a pandemic. As Trump botches the coronavirus crisis, I long for Giuliani. On Monday morning, I watched the news conferences held by Rudolph Giuliani on September 11, 2001, when he was still the mayor of New York. What drove me to review these news conferences was a simple question. What was Giuliani providing at a time of crisis that Donald Trump, facing potential emergency of a similar magnitude, is not? The real problem with the news conference on Saturday was that it was political, not informational, with Trump congratulating himself and running down Democrats. Forget Super Tuesday, it's the day after that matters. There is a strong possibility that Sanders would lose in a landslide and Trump would be reelected with a House, a Senate, and a White House, and a Supreme Court majority in his pocket, enabling him to govern with even more impunity than now for 4 more years. If the Democrats can rally behind a consensus center-left candidate, he or she will be in a strong position to beat Trump for 2 reasons. One new and obvious, one deep, less obvious, but very powerful. After 3 years of Trump WrestleMania rallies across America denouncing Democrats, the media and government experts, public servants, and patriots, Trump simply cannot run as a unifier. The indefatigable, unbeatable Benjamin Netanyahu. Once again, you can hear people calling king or magician. The exact final results are still unknown, but what we know indicates that after Israel's general election late yesterday, the country's 3rd in a year, Benjamin Netanyahu is likely to remain prime minister for at least a few more years. If his rivals do learn from him, Mr. Netanyahu, who's already shown that he wants the job more passionately than all others, will surely up the ante, making Israel more polarized and less tolerant. Yet there's good news in the election result, apart from the fact that a 4th election seems less likely. We learned that to win against a political opponent, one has to have a message more profound than everybody but him. In other words, a highly personal victory of Mr. Netanyahu, somewhat ironically, is also a triumph of substance, worldview, experience, philosophy, over, well, less substance. A Trump plan breaks a great deal for ranchers and park lovers. In Nevada's Great Basin National Park, ranchers who held public land grazing permits where the land became a part of the park in 1986 agreed to relinquish those permits in return for being compensated by the Conservation Fund, a nonprofit conservation group. Its new plan calls for reopening to grazing more than 85% of the lands protected by the original deal, giving cows free rein and dooming the fragile desert to be trampled and fouled by livestock, except for the narrow river corridor itself. The National Trade Association of Enterprises running livestock on public land, the Public Lands Council, seeking to preserve its members and influence, fiercely resist retiring or even a single acre of public land from grazing. Me Too doesn't always have to mean prison. For decades, victims and rights advocates, including many feminists, have stood behind the promise prosecutors routinely make to victims. We will absolve your pain by prosecuting your offender to the maximum possible extent. In the #MeToo era, there is a widespread presumption the best way to reckon with sexual misconduct and serve victims' interest is through the criminal system. A pilot program called Restore, which operated in Pima County, Arizona, from 2004 to 2007, worked with local prosecutors to offer victims of felony and misdemeanor sexual assault a restorative justice alternative. faulting the U.S. response to the coronavirus. We have a shortage of protective equipment for healthcare workers. At the health facility where I work, I was told that suppliers would no longer ship regular supplies of N95 respirator masks because of a shortage. Unless the shortage of personal protective equipment is rectified immediately, healthcare workers will be faced with a difficult choice. Do I do my job and risk my own life and that of my family, or do I stay home from work, knowing that patients will die from lack of medical care? Senator Rick Scott, Communist China cannot be trusted. Hospitals and health systems have a clear record of community benefit, and we have the numbers to prove it. In 2019, nonprofit hospitals provided $95 billion in value in community benefit programs, according to analysis by Ernst & Young. Rather than take a one-size-fits-all approach, hospitals and health systems are tailoring their programs and initiatives to meet pressing community needs. After decades of suspicion, Robert Durst faces justice. A surprise admission 19 years to the day after Miss Berman's body was found. Mr. Durst's lawyers made a stunning concession in a Christmas Eve court filing. After denying for nearly 2 decades that he had written the cadaver note, Mr. Durst now admitted to it. Mr. Durst is on trial for a single killing. Miss Berman's prosecutors will argue that they're all connected, that Mr. Durst killed Miss Berman because he was worried she was about to tell investigators what she knew about his wife, and that he killed Mr. Black, because his neighbor had discovered his true identity. Fire Carranza, why Asian Americans are targeting schools cheap. Dozens of Asian American parents filtered into a Queens auditorium in January, gathering to protest a local school desegregation plan that they said would drive their children to low-performing schools in far-off neighborhoods. Mr. Carranza, striking defense of the plan that summer. I just don't buy the narrative that any one ethnic group's own admission to these schools galvanized Asian American parents to oppose the plan, and Chancellor himself. There are nearly 1,800 public schools in New York, including high-performing, highly selective schools, and largely white and middle-class schools like Beacon High School that have admission systems controlled by the city. Global health crisis 1, economic policymakers 0, as leaders of the Group of Seven nation ended impromptu consultations on Tuesday with only a general expression of solidarity and refrained from concrete action. No pledge to cut interest rates, no promise of coordinated government spending. They underscored an uncomfortable truth, animating fears about the virus. Policymakers tasked with limiting its economic damage appear to be laboring under the assumption that their toolkit is nearly empty. The Fed appears to have taken action not out of some misplaced dream that lower interest rates are an antidote to the economic contagion, but in the hope of altering the psychology around it. For years, prominent economists have warned that the world has become addicted to monetary policy and its crises spawn low interest rates as the appropriate response for the nearly every economic concern. China stopped its economy to tackle coronavirus. Now the world suffers. In an industrial area west of Chicago's O'Hare International Airport, more than 6,000 miles from China, Michael Smirling is steeling himself for a devastating blow from the coronavirus outbreak. During China's Lunar New Year, Chilean farmers ship large containers of cherries to China, catching a window when the United States is out of season. Mr. Smirling, who owns the travel gear company LCI Brands, has long depended on China as a supplier, even though the trade wars between the United States and China made it more expensive to buy from here. What happens in Vegas if no one stays in Vegas? This week, thousands of people will travel to Vegas for business conferences. Last year, more than 6.6 million, or 15.5%, of the 42.5 million visitors to Las Vegas were there for conferences, according to data from the Las Vegas Convention and Visitors Authority. Las Vegas lost its first big conference last Monday when Adobe Systems canceled its annual event that was going to bring 20,000 visitors to hear headline speakers like the actress and entrepreneur Gwyneth Paltrow, the New England Patriots quarterback Tom Brady, and the comedian Chelsea Handler, along with chief executives and top officials from numerous companies. Will the coronavirus cause a recession? Keep your eye on the barbershops. Economists say a pandemic could clearly cause a recession in the United States. The Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development said Monday that a global growth could be cut in half to 1.5% in 2020 if the virus continues its spread. Lawrence Boone, the group's chief economist, warns that the forecast was not a worst-case scenario. As most economists think of it, a recession involves a cycle that feeds off on itself. Job cuts lead to less income, which lead to less spending, which lead to more job cuts. Trump campaign sues the Washington Post for libel. President Trump's re-election campaign sued the Washington Post for libel on Tuesday, citing 2 opinion articles from last year that linked Mr. Trump to Russian election interference. In a post on June 20th, Paul Waldman wrote, you know, who knows what sort of aid Russia and North Korea will give to the Trump campaign now that he's invited them to offer their assistance. The word invited in the article was hyperlinked to a transcript of an ABC News interview with Mr. Trump, in which he said he would consider accepting information from a foreign government about a political opponent. Mr. Trump's re-election campaign sued the Times on February 26, claiming that an essay published in the newspaper's opinion section last March falsely asserted a quid pro quo between Russian officials and Mr. Trump's 2016 campaign. Imagine this were your sister, Ronan Farrow tells Woody Allen's publisher. The journalist Ronan Farrow, the author of the best-selling book Catch and Kill, said on Tuesday that he would cut ties with his publisher, Hachette Book Group, after it announced one of its divisions was publishing Woody Allen's autobiography next month. Your policy of editorial independence among your imprints does not relieve you of your moral professional obligations as a publisher of Catch and Kill, and as a leader of a company being asked to assist in efforts by abusive men to whitewash the crimes, Mr. Farrow wrote in an email to Michael Peish, the chief executive of Hachette, whose Little Brown imprint published Catch and Kill. Miss Farrow, whose own first novel, Hush, will be published in the fall by Wednesday Books, an imprint of St. Martin's Press, also criticized the publisher for not contracting her for fact-checking, which she called an egregious abdication of Hachette's most basic responsibility. As coronavirus disrupts factories, India curbs exports of key drugs. The disruption is being felt most acutely in India, where the authorities on Tuesday ordered the country's vast pharmaceutical industry to stop exporting 26 drugs and drug ingredients, most of them antibiotics, without explicit government permission. That's a problem for the rest of the world, which relies on India's drug makers for much of its supply of generic drugs. Cipla, one of India's largest drug makers, whose main generic products include asthma inhalers and HIV drugs, declined to comment on Tuesday on the export limits, but said in a statement as enough inventory to last 1 or 2 months. Kept at the hospital on coronavirus fears, now facing large medical bills. After the release from quarantine, Mr. Wuczynski and his daughter went to stay with his mother in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. That's where they found a pile of medical bills waiting, $3,918, in charges from hospital doctors, radiologists, and an ambulance company. Mr. Wuczynski recalls other patients asking questions about how medical bills would be handled during daily town hall meetings for those quarantined at the Marine Corps station, who may be outside the patient's insurance network, provide services to hospital patients who may be outside the patient's insurance network, provide services to hospital patients is one of the major causes of surprise medical bills. Waive fees for coronavirus testing and treatment, health experts urge. New York is among the first states in the country to waive some fees and expenses for people who undergo testing for the coronavirus, as public health officials are increasingly worried that medical bills will discourage the poor and uninsured from getting medical care. In Illinois, the state insurance department said it encouraged health insurance issuers to consider all feasible and prudent options to reduce the barriers of cost sharing for tests and treatment of COVID-19 during the outbreak. If you're going to get tested for coronavirus and you're getting a battery of tests and doctor bills, then the government should pay, said Representative Ro Khanna, Democrat, California. High-flying trading app Robinhood goes down at the wrong time. Robinhood has become a Silicon Valley darling by presenting itself as a tech-savvy alternative to traditional stock trading platforms. Robinhood has attracted millions of millennials to trade on its platform, largely by eliminating trading fees, making stock trading as easy as ordering food online. The company does not charge trading fees, but it sells its customers' trades to high-frequency trading firms, a practice known as payment for order flow. With Disney, a Manhattan neighborhood reinvents itself, controlling a large chunk of Hudson Square. Trinity is among the largest landholders in New York. Silverstein, who is overseeing the construction of Disney's new building. The main stage will include 5 wood beams from his old Hudson Square location. Disney salvaged 30 beams and donated them to Mr. Dorff. Disney, which declined to provide an executive for an interview, pointed out its deep roots in New York. ABC moved to one of those stables on 166th Street in 1949, when the Upper West Side was a much wilder place. We're excited to invest in the growth and the development of Hudson Square, it said in a statement, and commit to Disney's long-term future. And I don't know why I'm shouting. I can't control the volume. That's been Wednesday, March 4th, 2020. Reading the Times, Wednesday from March 4th, 2020.